Good morning. Good morning, all of you. I, Rashmi Rameshwari, welcome all of you in COVID Task Force webinar series part 2. As we know that COVID-19 has changed our life completely, and so we have evolved ourselves. In this digital era, we are now not restricted in learning process. For this, COVID Task Force has initiated uh, some important thing, and for that we are connecting to various esteemed faculties as well as researchers so that we can learn new things. So in our today's lecture, we have connected to one of the esteemed guests. He is Dr. Vinod Sikaria, who is senior scientist at CSIR Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology, popularly known as IGIB. He is adjunct professor at Triple IT Delhi, and now he is working there. So looking to his educational profile, he did his undergraduate in medical education from Calicut Medical College, and further he did his PhD in computational biology from University of Pune. Vinod sir is clinician turned computational biologist. So we can look into how he did his research. First of all, let me share with you his important contribution towards this work. His laboratory is interested in understanding the function, organization, and regulation of vertebrate genome and how genomic variation could potentially impart them. He is also involved in creating novel methods and resources for analysis and annotation of genomes and understanding the functional impact of genomic variations. He has been part of collaborative genomic projects aimed at understanding the Asian genome diversity. He has also been part of the whole genome sequencing and analysis project, including the Indian, Sri Lanka, Malaysia Genome Project, and is member of the UGO Pan Asian Population Genomic Initiative Task Force. He is also co-founder of the Genomics for Understanding Rare Disease, and he has created his Indian Alliance Network for this. It is, as you can say, that the largest network of clinicians and researchers in which many Indians are working on rare genetic disease. He has adopted novel methods in which a large number of undergraduate students in collaborative projects are associated. So now, coming to his research profile, he has more than 150 publications till date. He has published books as well, two books and two books reviewed. Two books to his credit. He is also in the editorial board of Laws 1, Journal of Translational Medicine, Journal of Orthopedic, and International Journal of Rheumatic Disease. He is the recipient of CSIR Young Scientist Award for Biological Science in 2012. So this doesn't stop him here. He is also a Cavalli Frontiers of Science Fellow of US National Academy of Science in 2015 and an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Biology in 2007. So with this, now we are here to hear you, sir, and hope our students, our researchers, our faculty will gain a lot from you. So now over to you, sir.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be giving this talk over the web. And over the next 30 minutes or so, what I'm going to describe is what we have learned from the SARS-CoV-2 genomes from India. And before I start my talk, let me thank Professor Kannan and Dr. Rashmi for inviting me for this web session. And even before I start my talk, let me first introduce where I come from and what we do. I come from the Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology. popularly known as IGIB. And in our lab, we do a variety of things which is centered in this area called genome informatics. So essentially what we do is we look at genomes on computers, building algorithms as well as using algorithms built by others to be able to make biological sense out of genomes. The variety of programs that we work on, by large, we work on understanding the vertebrate genome and how it is organized and how it is regulated. We also have a very large program on non-coding RNAs, mostly working in the area of circular RNAs. What I'm going to talk about is a very small area, what we call as pathogenomics, that we initiated quite long back, almost 10 years ago. We used to work on Mycobacterium tuberculosis and slowly shifted into looking at emerging pathogens in India as well as across the globe. We also work, as Dr. Rashmi stated, with a lot of clinicians as part of translational initiatives, trying to look at mostly rare genetic diseases in the country and using genomic sequences to be able to understand what is really wrong with them or what is really abnormal in these individuals or families. We also work extensively, not just with clinicians, but also a number of researchers across the country and, of course, across the globe, to be able to also build genomic tools and resources to make these data sets publicly available and also accelerate new discoveries in these areas. So now coming back to the topic of discussion today, and over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to describe what we have been working in the area of coronavirus genomes in India in terms of looking at the analysis of genomes that are deposited in public domain. For the introduction, of course, I'm sure you're all probably aware about this. Coronavirus is caused by a pathogen, a virus, which is popularly known as a SARS-CoV-2. It's an RNA virus, a single stranded RNA virus of approximately around 30,000, just less than 30,000 base pairs. And as we know, it potentially arose at an outbreak from a seafood market in Wuhan and China. And of course, what we know today about the virus is that it belongs to the group of SARS-like coronaviruses. The genus is beta coronavirus. And of course, it has it has similarity to coronaviruses found previously in bats in China. Now, all that we know about the coronavirus genome is because the sequence of the coronavirus genome was available. And the first genome, what we call as the WH human one, originated from a patient from the seafood market in China. And this was deposited and published in public domain in early February this year. Now, what we know from the virus is that it has a very large similarity to a group of SARS coronaviruses of the genus beta coronavirus, and it is approximately 29,900 base pairs, and the sequencing was from a sample obtained from the bronchoalveolar lavage. Now, that brings us to what is sequencing and how do you sequence virus genomes. Of course, you could sequence virus genomes from a variety of biological samples. In this particular case, to extrapolate on what was published, this came from the bronchoalveolar lavage, but you could also have virus material isolated from, for example, nasopharyngeal swabs. You could also, in some cases, isolate from saliva. You could isolate from many other body fluids, including feces. Now, what happens to these samples? The total RNA extraction is undertaken in usually a containment facility, typically of biosafety level 2. And once the RNA is isolated, you need to deplete the ribosomal RNA because these RNAs are, of course, going to contain human RNA as well as a viral RNA. And when you have human RNA, the largest component of human RNA is essentially the ribosomal RNA, and therefore you need to deplete the ribosomal RNA. And once you've depleted the ribosomal RNA, you can create a library, and that goes into a sequencing, into one of the sequencing equipments and multiple sequencing technologies that are currently available using multiple different chemistries and biological properties. And once you've sequenced, you generate what we call as a sequence data. And sequence data is a digital format, typically a text file format, what we call as a FASTQ. And once you have taken the sequence format, of course, I will delve deep into it in the coming slides. You do a lot of QCs, removing bad quality bases. And once you have done all the QCs and you have got good quality data, you use computers to be able to assemble these genomes and of course validate the genome and put them into the perspective of a phylogenetic analysis. I'm going to delve deep into each of these steps further down in the talk. Now, the basis of all what we sequence and what we know today about shotgun sequencing is because one, we have high throughput sequencers which can generate millions of base pairs of data in a given day or a given point in time. So essentially what you do is you have genomes or DNA pieces, which are of course I stated mixed material because it would contain human RNA or DNA and of course the viral RNA or DNA. Now, what really happens in the experimental process is that you shear or you cut these pieces into much smaller fragments. And these smaller fragments, typically of around 150 base pairs or so or less, are sequenced using the sequencer. And once you have sequenced, you have the sequence information of these fragments in lengths, anything ranging from 36 base pairs to 150 base pairs. And using this sequence information, you can ask computers to align or find nearby matches so that you can stitch together these fragments to reconstruct the original genome from which these fragments came from. And this is the process what we call as assembly. Now, there are multiple ways of assembling genomes. One is a reference-based assembly. That means that you already know what you are sequencing, for example, coronavirus, and you already have the genome of coronavirus. Fortunately, we do so. You could look at these fragments and ask the question, how many of these fragments align to the virus genome that I have? And this is called a reference-based assembly. That means you use a reference to assemble the reads or the fragments that come from the sequencer. And the other approach that you could use is what we call as a de novo assembly. That necessarily means that you don't have a reference genome or you don't know what is in the genome. You can ask the computer to stitch together these fragments. And if you have enough number of fragments that you can stitch together, you can practically reconstruct the entire genome. And therefore, you don't require any a priori information about what is there in the sample. So whatever is there in the sample and whatever is there at appropriate coverage, which can stitch together using algorithms, can actually form the fragment that is delineated as a de novo fragment. Now, assembling genomes is a multi-step process, but believe me, it is not very complicated. Most of you with a bit of computational knowledge and access to a fairly good computer, approximately 8 GB of RAM. Most PCs and workstations today come with this kind of a configuration, or probably better configurations. You could do assembly of genomes. And of course, we did put up one of this detailed protocols where you can follow through each of these processes or steps by which you can do a QC, you can do an estimates of the viral assembly, you can do the validation, so on and so forth, and be able to look at a fairly good assembly, either by reference-based approach or using a de novo approach, depending upon the datasets that you have. Now, many of these datasets, fortunately, are also available in public domain, thanks to researchers who have shared freely this information in public domain. This also includes sequences that are derived from isolation in India. And therefore, it's a wonderful opportunity for students like you to be able to go back to this data and be able to also learn the process of assembly and annotation. Now, the basis of all that we do in terms of genomics is based on this concept that virus evolves over time. And you will see this slide over and over again, because this is essentially central to almost all that I'm going to talk about in the next 30 minutes or so. Now, most of us, for example, humans, do not evolve in timelines of weeks or months, right? Because the genetic material that we inherit as an individual at birth, by, of course, fertilization and formation of the embryo, stays pretty much the same across your life until you die. Of course, there are exceptions to this, and exceptions are, of course, where you develop somatic mutations, which are not really transmitted into the next generation. And somatic mutations occur in in cells which divide very rapidly, for example, skin, for example, cells in the liver. And of course, they could give rise to diseases, and they could give rise to diseases like, for example, cancer, which are caused by mutations and stimulated by a lot of other environmental factors. But I'm not talking about humans. The most of the human genome remains constant across the lifespan of the individual, and therefore we're not really talking about timescales of evolution of days of years. But now, unlike these, the viruses evolve quite rapidly. Now, why does the virus evolve quite rapidly? One, because they use the host machinery for practically every single thing that they do, whether it's viral replication, whether it's making proteins, they entirely rely on the host machinery. And of course, you divide at a very, very large rate, you can actually create millions of copies of RNA by invading a few cells. And this entire process overwhelms the capacity of the human proofreading mechanism, and therefore this can introduce a lot of mutation. Now, as we know today, the virus, as it transmits from one individual to another individual, typically in around 7 to 15 days, undergoes mutation. So, in other words, if you had contacted coronavirus at point, say, day 0, and you develop the disease, and during the course of the disease, you transmitted the virus to another individual, typically around a week or so, you would have the virus already mutate and create a new virus, which is different by a few base pairs. Now, this is essentially how the virus evolves, and this is essentially central to all the analysis that I'm going to discuss in the slides. Now, to give an example, of course, we heard about the WH1, which is the first genome sequence to be available for these particular strain of coronavirus, or the SARS-CoV-2. Now, if you look at the second genome which was available, that second genome was available from Jan 8 for an individual collected from Jan 8, of course, sequenced much later. And you would have seen that from December 26 to Jan 8, it's approximately around 14 days. The virus has already accumulated one mutation at the 186th position. And of course, then if we take another genome, which is sequenced that are isolated from February 27, that is approximately 2 months later, it is accumulated multiple mutations. So in other words, as the virus transmits from an individual to another individual and passes on, it accumulates mutations, and these mutations are essentially going to identify the virus as it evolves. And of course, this can be used to trace the virus from where it came from and how did it evolve. Now, all that is possible today in terms of viral genomics is thanks to a lot of researchers who have uploaded their genome data sets in public domain. And you would really be amazed to learn that through the epidemic, right, we have almost 6 months through the epidemic, we have approximately 40,000 plus genomes available from across the world. And this includes genomes from multiple different countries at multiple different time points, trying to understand how the virus has mutated and how the virus has evolved. And of course, there are very large programs from across the world, including the FOG UK consortium, which today has uploaded close to around 18,000 genomes in public domain. Now, this is a wealth of information which is available, and I urge all students to really go back and understand how open data is really changing the face of modern biology and bioinformatics, and how this opens up a new opportunity to understand viral epidemics at much greater depth and detail. Most of the resources, of course, cannot allow you to search through the data sets. So we have built one of these data sets and databases, which is called Genomepedia. Of course, you could go back and look at these resources. This is a very easy to use resource where you can actually search by a country name, by a strain name, by a particular location, and you can retrieve information for that particular strains. And it will also tell you where to go and download these strains from, whether it's what is the GSAID ID for this particular virus, so that you can go back, search through what you want, and be able to download those genome sequences. Now, like I said before, the virus virus mutates and evolves as it transmits from individual to individual. Now, what that necessarily means is that you could classify viruses, so you can cluster viruses based on the similarities, uh, in colloquial sense, but in practical senses, more based on the differences that they have, differences in terms of what are the mutations they have. So as a virus evolves over time, you could actually create a contact tracing of the virus in terms of the mutations that it accumulates over time. And you could actually build a tree, what as you see here, and this is what we call as a phylogenetic tree. Now, phylogenetic trees can be made for different kinds of data sets. Like, for example, it could be phenotypic data sets, like, for example, number of limbs, the height of the organism, etc., etc. Or it could also be based on genomic information, and therefore it is called a phylogenetic tree, right? So it's based on a genomic information. It's called a phylogenetic. So phylogenetic trees can be built across different classes of viruses, different species of organisms, different isolates of the same species or the same strain. Now, it's all built on the same very simple concept that you would have clusters which come together and be defined as a clade. And when they come together, that necessarily means that they share a lot of information between them, or they share a lot of mutations between them, or rather dissimilarities between them. And then, therefore, they could be clustered together. Now, of course, building a phylogenetic tree is also quite simple. Of course, you could go back to this link on a very detailed discourse on how to build a phylogenetic tree from genome sequences that you have in hand.
The slide is not moving.
Okay. Can you see it now?
A slide is coming, but you haven't changed it. Slide change.
Okay.
Have you changed? It is the first page only.
Just check it out. Can you see the slides now?
Yeah, slide is visible, sir. But I think you have changed it. You haven't changed it.
Now you're seeing the phylogenetic analysis slide?
No, it is not.
Pardon me?
Phylogenetic slide is not coming.
I don't know what happened. Sorry for that.
Just you click it, move to that one. It will come. You again share it. Yes, it came.
It
It
has
came
come
now.
now? Yeah.
It came.
Yeah, thank you. So you could also build a phylogenetic tree from the datasets that you have in hand. And the particular link or the protocol that we have made available allows you to follow the commands in very great detail. And you can also go back and understand what these commands mean. And you can also build your own phylogenetic tree. Okay. Now, what we know today in terms of genomes has been compiled in this very large database and phylogenetic tree, what we call as a NextStrain. Now, NextStrain is a web interface built by the Trevor Bradford Lab. And as you see here, this is a phylogenetic tree of a few thousand genomes from December 2019 to May 2020. And each dot represents a particular genome. So you know that, and the x-axis is the timeline. So you know how the genomes have come and clustered together at different timelines. When the sequence is clustered together, you define it as a clade. At this moment, we have 10 clades of viruses known. This includes the A supercluster, which includes A1A, A2, A2A, A3, and A6, and of course A7. We have the B supercluster, which contains the B, B1, B2, and B4. And the supercluster has some meaning to it. The A supercluster essentially are the strains which were isolated from Europe and Americas. And the B supercluster are essentially strains which originated out of China, out of Wuhan. So they are the ancestral strains, and of course the strains which were isolated from all of Southeast Asia. So you could see that clusters of sequences define a clade, and the clade could also mean where was the geographic preponderance of this particular strain or isolate, or where did it really come from. Now, I'm coming back to the same concept that the virus evolves by mutations, and since you have mutations and you can type mutations by sequencing, you could understand the contact or origin of the virus, and of course you can find the ancestor of this virus. So, and by doing this, for example, you can build contact maps on a timeline and really understand as individuals move across the country. For example, this is a map of India. As individuals move across the country, they also bring the virus and transmit the infection to a different part of the country. And when they transmit it to a different part of the country, they are also going to transmit the virus for which they have a mutation, and the mutation background is going to be defined by where this virus originally came from. So this is a map of how the pre-lockdown individuals have got transmitted, have traveled across the country and have transmitted infections. And some of this is actually after the lockdown has been lifted. So that's the information. Now, as we now go into the Indian genomes of SARS-CoV-2, there are at this moment over 700 genomes of SARS-CoV-2 deposited from over 19 medical and research institutions across the country. This includes all the big names, right, from ICMR to national institutes like IGIB, the NCDC, CCMB, and by large, the largest number of genomes deposited in India is from a very small institute in Gujarat, which is called the Gujarat Biotechnology Research Center, which has sequenced and deposited close to around 170 strains or isolates of SARS-CoV-2. And in terms of the genome coverage, we have around 21 states and union territories represented at this moment, giving you a fairly good idea of what is happening in terms of the virus and evolution in the country. And this is one example of the field of open data, where a large number of researchers selflessly have uploaded their data sets in public domain to help researchers accelerate the understanding about the virus and evolution. Now, you would ask, why should people sequence viruses and put them in public domain? Of course, there's a reason to that. One, as I stated, you could understand the evolution of the virus and how they are circulating. You could also understand the origin of the infections. You can understand the source of the community outbreak, and of course, you can use this information to build better diagnostics and therapeutics. And I apologize for the typos on the slide. So as we go to India, you would see that the Indian isolates could also be clustered, and to be exact, this could be clustered into 6 of the existing clades, which was the A1A, A2A, A3, B, B4, and the B1. Now, there's a large cluster, as you see here in magenta, and this cluster of genomes could not be mapped into any one of the existing 10 clades as far as next strain. So we call this particular cluster as the I-A3I strain, I standing for a very significant large cluster arising from India, and A3I to denote that this is a strain which seemingly have diverged from the A3 cluster of the genome. And there's a bit of story to these clusters. Of course, the blue ones, the large set of blue ones on the top that you see are the A2A strains, and the A supercluster, as I stated before, originated out of Europe. And they're essentially the strains or isolates which traveled with individuals out of Europe and Americas. And this, by large, of the largest cluster of strains or isolates globally. The second largest cluster, of course, is a unique, distinct cluster, distinct rather than unique, which we call as the I cluster. The I cluster seemingly came from the Southeast Asia. And of course, there's a story to that, and I'll come to that in the next set of slides, and emerged as one of the largest cluster of genomes from across the country. Then, of course, you have minor subtypes. This includes the first genomes out of the individuals who traveled out of Wuhan, Kerala, which fall into the B supercluster. And the B supercluster is essentially formed of the P4 and the P1 clades. Mostly individuals have traveled from China into India, or individuals have traveled from Southeast Asia into India who carry the P strain or the P isolate. By large, these are essentially small cluster of genomes, and they are very small or minority in terms of the population. And this is also an example to also elucidate how the early lockdown of air travel out of China has impacted in terms of the viral transmission, because the B strains essentially originated out of China and Southeast Asia. And the early lockdown in terms of air travel from out of China ensured that we do not have a lot of B strains coming into India. But of course, during the time of the blockade of air travel from China, we still had a lot of people traveling out of Europe and out of America into India, and that essentially contributed possibly to the large number of A2A clades in India. You could also go back and browse this data in a browsable interface, and this interface is called Philovis. You could access this resource at the URL provided below. And this resource also allows you to click on each of these virus isolates and understand more about this virus. Sorry. You could also draw the clusters in multiple different formats. You could look at the timelines. You could play a video to understand how the virus evolved over time and spread across the country, and so on and so forth. Now, when I say they are clades, clades are also demarcated or identified by the very specific mutations that they carry. And as we know today, the 6+1 and 7 clades that we have in India at this moment could be demarcated approximately by around 15 mutations. And each of these clades would have one or more of these mutations almost exclusively identifying the particular clade or the particular type of virus. And as you see here from this figure, these are essentially the proportion of samples which have that particular mutation, and the dots are colored by the clades. And as you'd see here, there are very few overlaps between clades. For example, one of the overlap is for the A3 clade, which shares a variant at smaller proportions with the IA3I clade. And that's essentially why we call it as A3I, because it shares a mutation with the A3 clade, or it would have possibly evolved from the A3 clade. Now, based on these mutations, or if the identity of these mutations in a particular strain or isolate of SARS-CoV-2, you could classify them into a particular clade. So in many ways, in the future, you might not need to do genome sequences of all isolates, but probably you need to just do genotyping or typing the identity of these variants, of around 15 variants in isolates, to be able to classify them into one of these clades which are available. Now, when I talked about evolution, you could now look at evolution at a genome scale and evolution in terms of each clades. So in this particular analysis, we did consider clades which have large proportions of the clades in India. So there are 4 large clades, which is more than 10 genomes, and this span over time. And this allows you to understand how does a virus evolve over the time. In other words, you can now look at the genome sequences and look at the differences between genome sequences spaced by time, and be able to understand what is the rate at which the virus mutates over time. And this rate is depicted as the substitution rate in a number of sites that could mutate or get substituted per base per year. So if you take all the strains together, the virus mutates at the rate of around 1.48 in 10⁻³ sites per base per year. And this roughly translates to 1.48 into 30, because there are approximately 30,000 base pairs. That is approximately 44 mutations per year. And that necessarily means that the virus mutates at around 3.7 new mutations per month. That roughly translates to approximately 1 mutation every week. So that necessarily means that if you have a virus today, and if you transmit the virus to another individual after 5 to 7 days, the other individual will have a new mutation apart from the mutations that the virus already has, right? So that allows you to now understand and trace the virus at much greater detail. Now you could also look at the virus evolution across different clades. A2A by large is the largest clade, and A2A mutation is approximately 1.42 into 10 to the power minus 3. And I, or the distinct Indian cluster of viruses, mutates much lesser at the rate of around 1.19 mutations or substitutions per site per year. You'll see that compared to the average cluster evolution, and compared to the A2A, which is the predominant cluster in India, the I cluster seemingly mutates at a much lower rate. We're not really sure why this is and what are the consequences of this. Of course, we will detail that in the coming slide. You can also look at the mutation rate in the different genes of the virus. So in this particular analysis, we take only the core genes, which are the spike protein, the envelope protein, the membrane protein, and the nucleocapsid protein, which are essentially core genes or structural genes which are required by the virus. And as you see here, there are also distinct differences at the gene level evolution of the virus strains. For example, the A2A evolves in the N gene or the nucleocapsid gene. And you should also keep in mind that the N gene is also one of the targets for the diagnostic primers and probes. And you would see here how, therefore, it could impact in terms of the diagnosis using RT-PCR probes. What's really important for the I cluster is that it has a much lesser evolution for the S or the spike protein. As you see here, almost a fourth of the rate of mutation compared to the A2A. And the one thing that you need to keep in mind is that the spike protein is essentially very important for recognition of the human host. And of course, it's one of the active targets for vaccine design. So it's probably good news that it evolves at a much slower rate at the spike protein. Now, if you ask what are the proportions of these clades, the major clades, let's consider for the time being just two, because together they encompass more than 90% of all isolates, which is the A2A, which is the predominant clade, and I, or the A3I, which is a distinct Indian clade. So what you find is that different states would have different proportions of these clades. For example, if you look at Gujarat, a significant large majority of the isolates would have A2A compared to what you, for example, see in Andhra Pradesh, where a significant large majority, close to around 70%, is of the I cluster. You could, of course, look at Delhi. There's a small dot over there with a pi outside the map. A significant large majority, over 50%, belongs to the I. Now, looking at the phylogenetic tree, you can also make a lot of assumption in terms of how this virus originated and evolved. A typical phylogenetic tree would contain leaves that diverge at different time points. Compared to this particular phylogenetic tree, as you see here, it all diverged at one single point, which suggests that the virus originated out of possibly an outbreak, followed by spread across different states. Now, this clade is pretty much represented in a large number of states, I think around 19 states as we count today, at different proportions. For example, if you look at Orissa, it is a very, very small proportion. If you look at Kerala, of course, the number of genomes from Kerala is very small, but there's no representation in Kerala. And varying the proportions of the clades occur in different states of the country. Now, the clades are also dynamic over time. It's not that a particular clade stays as a dominant clade over time. And as you see here, the clade was a predominant clade sometime in the month of March, but the IA3I clade. But over time, as you go across that data set, the clade seems to have been slowly replaced by the A2A, or the predominant clade of European or American origin. And the bottom panel, or the B panel, essentially shows how the sequences were available over time and how the proportions of the clades have also changed over time. So, for example, if you look at Maharashtra, sometime in March and April, there was a large number of isolates from the IA3I clade. And as you go further over time, the number of IA3I genomes have actually come significantly down. Now, for example, if you look at Telangana, the same pattern that you see during March, April, there was extensively large number of IA3I clades. But if you look at the later genomes after May, you would see practically 100% representation of leader A2A clade. So these differences could be because of the early efforts to control epidemics, because people were alert and people were aware about the epidemic, and we could handle the epidemic at much greater resolution. So probably individuals who got the IA3I were quarantined very early on and taken good care of, so they were replaced by the later breakouts of the A2A clade. And of course, there could be effects of lockdown. There are multiple different rounds of lockdowns now. And of course, this could also be influenced by interstate travel. For example, this explains why the A2A from Gujarat have become a predominant cluster in, for example, Orissa, because a large number of people during the lockdown and after the lockdown has traveled from Gujarat to Orissa. And this analysis was essentially done by Divyatej Sopati from the CSIR. Now, what we really do not know is also very important to address here. We really do not know how does the pathogenicity change between these two clusters. We are at the moment working with a large number of clinicians across the country to be able to address this particular question and try to understand does the clade A2A and the clade I have a different or difference in terms of the pathogenicity, in terms of the infectivity, in terms of the immune response, or in terms of the outcomes of infection, which could be quantified, for example, as the fatality out of the infection. We also do not know why the virus evolves much slower compared to the predominant A2A cluster, which is also predominant across the world. It could possibly because of an artifact, because of the phylogenetic topology, because as I stated earlier, the virus seems to have evolved out of a single outbreak and then followed by rapid spread across the country. This could also be because of functional variations, because two of the variants which are very predominantly distinctly different in this particular clade come from the RDRP gene or the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase gene, and probably RNA-dependent RNA polymerase functional variations could mean that it's a much efficient system of RNA replication, and then therefore could contribute to a high fidelity and lower rate of replication errors. So we don't really know these answers at this moment. We are on this task of trying to address these issues in a more scientific and data-driven approach. Now, what's really more important to understand genomes and genomic variants for, of course, students is to be able to access this genomic information without having to assemble and annotate this information over and over again. And as I stated before, there are 700 odd genomes available. As of today morning, there's 705. And it's almost impossible, and probably it is a waste of resources if you are trying to assemble it over and over again by different groups. So it's very essential that a standardized protocol is followed to be able to assemble and annotate these variants, and we may make it available in public domain. So a large number of researchers can access this, download this, and make independent scientific problems, questions to be able to address the pertinent hypothesis. Now, this resource is essentially created by a group which is called Indico, which indexes all the 705 strains or isolates and sequences from India, and provides a searchable interface where you can search by probably a nucleotide change, you can search by protein change, you can search it by the genes, you can also search it by isolates and isolate IDs, or by the state names or the institute names, so that you can access these variants and information for all the strains out there. The resource also provides a set of pre-computed annotations so that you don't require to annotate them over and over again. But having said that, at this moment, this is an open call to all researchers out there across the country to be able to provide annotations for variants in areas that they deem fit and they deem important, so that people do not recreate these annotations over and over again, but make these annotations publicly available at a single point so a lot more researchers can access this information. Like, for example, one of the pertinent questions that people would want to ask is that how many of these variants would change epitopes? For example, if you are involved in vaccine design, and for example, you could see a complete section on vaccine or epitopes, where you can look at the variants and see how many of these variants do fall into the epitopes. So this is a page which describes one single variant, for example, the D614G, which essentially classifies the A2A clade. And as you see here, one of these variants, the D614G variant, essentially falls into the sulfurous glycoprotein domain, and it falls right into the epitope on the S protein. Now, of course, there are open questions. There are more, far more questions unanswered than the ones which are answered. And some of these are very pertinent and urgent. And I list some of these very pertinent, urgent questions out there so that a lot of researchers can now actively get involved into contributing and analyzing data. One of the most important things is to be able to use this data to build better diagnostics. Better diagnostics because, as stated before, there are mutations in the virus, and mutations could fall into the sites where the primers or probes bind to the virus. And if they don't bind because of the mutation, they should change the free energy of binding. You could actually produce an erroneous result in the testing. Now, given this information of viral variations and the frequency of variations in the viral genome, you could now build better diagnostics which can avoid or factor in the variations out there. The second more important question is, how does these variations affect immune epitopes? Do they fall in immune epitopes, making them less immune or more immune? Or do they create new epitopes altogether just by virtue of a new mutation which can change an amino acid? And there, you could use this information to probably build better vaccines. Better is still relative because we do not have a vaccine yet. And of course, on a scientific perspective, what's really more important to look at amino acid changing variations and understand how does it functionally impact the virus evolution or the virus function, a function of individual genes in terms of the replication efficiency of the virus, in terms of the transmissibility of the virus, in terms of the evolution of the virus. And of course, as I stated before, the urgent need is probably to avoid false positives and false negatives. Both of them are really bad in terms of diagnosing individuals with COVID. And the state-of-the-art diagnosis today rely on real-time PCRs. Real-time PCRs are based on probes and primers which bind to the viral RNA. And the efficiency of the binding of the types of probes, primers of the probes, are depending upon what are the variations at these sites. And therefore, you could create a false positive or false negative result with diagnostic testing by virtue of genetic variation. So as researchers out there, what is really more important is to now be able to factor in the genetic variations in the Indian population and now be able to understand what are the primers and probes which would probably be better suited for the Indian scenario. And of course, use this information to probably build better diagnostics or better primers and probes in regions which are not quite mutating at large efficiency. And of course, as researchers, you could contribute a large number of programs, a lot of open research programs across the world. We were probably one of the early groups to actually put all the resources and the data sets in public domain to aid researchers who would want to contribute, or of course take this information to build and address their own hypothesis. I invite you to contribute and of course use the resources which are publicly available. The large number of epidemiology data sets, which includes the testing rates, the birth and death rates, the hospital beds, a lot of information on the demographics of each of the states in India. And this would allow researchers to build models which can plan on the healthcare utilization. For example, You could look at how there's a healthcare capacity um, uh, sufficiency in terms of the resources. You could look at the viral genomes and genome evolution. You could use the information on the primers and probes, which are, of course, collected from public resources by a large number of students like you who have contributed to collecting this from literature, from brochures of testing kits, so on and so forth. There are a lot of researchers now working on potential therapeutics and compiling the chemical properties of these therapeutics. And of course, we work on rare diseases, so we are very much interested into working on the impact of COVID on rare genetic disorders. And for right reasons, because a set of genetic disorders seem to be protected from COVID infection by virtue of the mutations that they have, especially in the immune response genes. And of course, for people who are inclined into building computer algorithms and apps, we have a COVID-19 Connect app, which tries to connect researchers, clinicians, patients, and caregivers. Of course, there are a lot of things happening, and I invite you to come and have a look at the resources out there. And as usual, I do all the talking. The work is done by a lot of people out there. A lot of people who worked from the lab and of course from outside the lab, compiling a lot of resources and taking leadership role in this bad or distinct times. And of course, a lot of collaborators, Sridhar for most of the NGS, which generated out of IGIB, and Divya and Rakesh for most of the NGS datasets and analysis, which originated out of CCMB. And CSIR is taking a leading role in the sequencing and surveillance program, contributing to both clinical testing, clinical surveillance, genome sequencing across different laboratories in the country. And of course, the kudos should go to the researchers from multiple different organizations across the funding bodies, whether it's CSIR, whether it's CBT, whether it's ICMR, have all come together for a common cause to be able to sequence genomes and make this available in public domain in either the GISAID dataset or as part of the GenBank in the NIH. And of course, all that I talked was funded by the CSIR through multiple different grants and grants which are accelerated in the difficult times thanks to fantastic managers in this granting agencies. I think I'll stop there and take questions. But before that, in interest of, and of course, advertising a lot of things that happen in the lab, I invite researchers to probably download this app if you have an Android phone. And if you're willing to contribute to any of these resources and building these resources and making them better, please do write to me. Thank you, and I'll take questions.
Thank you, sir. Very nice presentation. And now we are able to get insight into the COVID-19, its Indian perspective we came to know. And it's now very, very helpful for us as well as researchers, those who are particularly working in this area. So now we have some questions from our research group as well as from our students. I want to start from very first one. Sir, one question is why this virus is more dangerous than other coronavirus?
It is, it is dangerous from other coronaviruses due to two reasons. One, it mutates. Second, it is transmitted far and wide. Also because of ubiquitous travel across continents. So if you ask the same question that what could have been done to contain the infection, one single measure to contain the infection would be to avoid travel, because all the viruses have come in through travel by mostly air from across different parts of the world. And if we could have prevented travel from across the world into India, yes, we could have treated much lesser number of individuals with the virus.
Sir, the other question is why this virus changes host when it is specific for a particular host previously? Matlab, why this virus is changing now human genome? Why, what made it capable for, and earlier it used to harbor some other host?
Right. So this is part of the virus evolution. As I said, the virus is mutating, and all coronaviruses are mutating. Not that just coronaviruses, practically all viruses are mutating. The mutations happen at different rates, and it is just what you call as a point in time where the mutation makes it better suited to jump the host. So it is practically part of the virus evolution. This is not the first case that a virus is mutated and jumped the host, and probably this is not going to be the last case um, of such a jump in host. So viruses, as they evolve, are going to have mutations, and mutations are going to give them some fitness advantage at some point in time, and the fitness advantage would necessarily mean that they would probably jump the host if better fit. So it is just part of the virus evolution. There's pretty much nothing that you can do to prevent or curtail evolution because virus loves mutating. So does humans. As humans evolve over years, over centuries, viruses also evolve, but at timelines much shorter than humans.
Okay, sir. There is one another question. Is there a role of natural killer cells against COVID-19? Or
So yeah, so all immune response systems are important in COVID. This includes both innate as well as adaptive immune response, and the genes involved in both these sets. Now, I'll not be the right person to state exactly which set of genes and which set of immune responses are important. But from the literature that emerges, for example, on patients which suffer from agammaglobulinemia because of BTK mutations, they seem to be better hoped to contain the virus and contain the transmission of the virus. We really do not know why this happens because it is paradoxical to believe so because they are immunodeficient individuals. But nevertheless, immunodeficient individuals, at least in some reports, as I suggest, could handle the virus at a much better fashion compared to normal individuals.
sir, one question from student side. How does cell machinery recognize viral genome as some mRNAs to translate? How these mRNAs get translated?
The mRNA gets translated because they have all the necessary features like any other RNA to be able to make proteins. So they have the ribosomal binding sites. They have the codons which can recognize the tRNAs, or rather the tRNAs recognize the codons, so on and so forth. So they're essentially going to be hijacking the cellular machinery to making it believe that this is just another messenger RNA. But nevertheless, it is not a cognate messenger RNA human, it's a viral RNA. So it essentially uses the entire host machinery to be able to survive, reproduce, and transmit out into the next cell.
Sir, one question is why aren't we using a common antiviral shot that is administering a very non-lethal dose of the virus so as to develop resistance against COVID?
Yeah, so there are different strategies of developing immune response. This could involve, for example, inactivated virus, a gamma inactivated virus. A whole virus could be just inactivated and could be used to elicit immune response. The other strategy is to make an inactivated live virus. Of course, there are few labs working on it. Nothing has really come out in terms of the development. But you could make an inactive virus to be able, or a live inactivated virus to be able to elicit immune response. You could make very specific viral proteins, like for example, the S protein, to elicit an immune response. In one of the active candidates, you could just keep the RNA of the virus so that the cellular machinery makes proteins and elicits an immune response. So of course, there are multiple different ways and means to elicit immune response. But what is really unknown at this moment in time is what is a protective immune response, right? Immune response is one part of it, but what is really more important is an immune response which can protect the infection. And we are really far from understanding what's the immune response that is protected.
Sir, coming to this question, which is quite common, is there evidence that this virus originated from virology lab in Wuhan deliberately or by mistake?
So genomics cannot really address that question at this moment in time. So yeah, I'm not really sure.
Okay, sir. And another common question, is the virus weakening as claimed by some researcher? In India, we are coming up that this virus is now becoming less virulent as it came earlier.
So the analysis of the genomic substitution rates over time doesn't show much of a difference. So we really do not know what what is the qualification to call it less virulent, because frankly speaking, we don't really understand the virulence of the virus at much greater detail to be able to suggest whether it has become more or less virulent. In terms of the substitution rates have remained constant across the time. So we are not really be able to qualify that state.
Sir, do the environmental condition plays any role in virus survival?
Of course, environmental conditions play a very great role in virulence. The just fact that you can prevent infections by wearing masks, and mask by itself is an environmental change, right? Signifies that you can use environmental factors to change the virulence of the organism.
Sir, in news it came that some part of India, like Gujarat, had a more virulent strain comparative to other parts. Is this true or?
So, like I stated in my slide, we don't really know the pathogenicity or the valence difference between the strains or the clades. It's just yet an unanswered question. But having said that, it's also an opportunity at this point in time to go back and look at clinical information, collect the clinical information in great detail, and be able to address this question at high resolution.
Sir, it was again in news that suggests that there is a relationship between blood group and COVID. That a particular blood group is more prone to this infection. Is
Yeah,
this?
So this is out of a study, not really published, but available in public domain, which suggests that O blood group people have less odds of contacting COVID. Well, this is still on a very small cohort of individuals and most are retrospective analysis. There is need for more randomized approaches to be able to confirm this observation. So at this moment, I will qualify it only as an observation in a cohort of individuals, not really a fact that can be used to qualify individuals in terms of susceptibility across the world.
Sir, it's a question from our student. He is asking that is there any vertical transmission role from pregnant women to their fetus, and why doesn't the SARS-CoV-2 affect the fetus? As you are clinician, any?
It is not that SARS-CoV-2 doesn't affect fetuses, and it doesn't mean that it cannot affect newborns. There are reports where SARS-CoV-2 has affected fetuses and newborns. So, yeah, but of course, the number of such reports is small. That doesn't qualify it either way. But there are reports.
Okay. Sir, there is one question. Is there any threshold to how many mutations the virus can undergo?
There's nothing like a threshold on the number of mutations the virus can undergo. But of course, you could qualify saying that there would be a point in time when the virus cannot mutate anymore. So it will probably start remutating the sites that it has already mutated, because it's a random process and it is based on the fitness advantage. So if the mutation provides a less fitness advantage, of course, those mutations will not emerge anymore, or and then therefore those isolates would die. So theoretically, yes, there is a finite number of mutations that the virus can have. But that, of course, virus is quite large, has 30,000 base pairs. So it's going to take a a large number of years before we arrive at that point.
Sir, we have one question from our student. Um, can we suppress the expression of ACE2 receptor so that spike protein doesn't bind to the receptor?
Yes, there are drug therapeutic modalities where you can suppress AC2, the receptor for the virus. But of course, what you should remind is that it is not just AC2 is just for a virus entry. AC2 has also cognate functions in the body, and therefore you cannot really have a large margin to play with such molecules, because then you would affect the normal function of those receptors.
Sir, another question. BioGrid, which is a virtual private network of the Department of Biotechnology, does it enable access by students and scientific community from country? Is there any joint program currently between IGIB and BioGrid to get benefit for the COVID pandemic research?
At this moment, we do not have any ongoing activity with the BioGrid, so I will not be able to comment on that. But having said that, there are a lot of computational resources now publicly available across multiple different institutions that the students can access. This includes some of them which are maintained by the IITs, some of them which are maintained by the CDAC. So there are quite a number of computational resources which are available to student researchers across the country at this moment.
One question from our undergraduate student. How you look at a correlation between herd immunity and genetic makeup of population?
Well, there's not much of a correlation between the genetic makeup of the population and the herd immunity, because herd immunity is essentially a factor of how many number of individuals are infected in the population. The whole genetic factors are not of large odds to be able to change infectivity by, say, 5 or 6 folds. So, yeah, there would be a correlation, but that correlation could be minimal.
Sir, another question from our faculty. ICMR is claiming there is no community transmission, but the data probably contradicts this, as we see that the case is rising. So what's your opinion? Can you throw some light on this?
So yeah, my take on that would be that genomics cannot suggest or prove or disprove that there was or there was not contact transmission. Probably it is the epidemiologist who should answer that question at much greater detail.
Sir, we have one question from student. Why the use of steroids a controversy against treatment of COVID?
Pardon me, I didn't get that question.
Can a steroid be used against treatment for COVID?
Yeah, so the treatment of COVID, of course, I mean, frankly speaking, there is nothing called a treatment for COVID, because there is no antiviral conclusively found to be effective to treat COVID. Many of the antivirals are in clinical trials. So practically speaking, any molecule for treatment of COVID at this point of time is controversial. Now, having said that, a lot of evidence is emerging on how immunomodulators could modulate the COVID disease once infected. How does it modulate the disease over time in an individual? And immunomodulators, including steroids, apart from other molecules, including immunosuppressants, have been explored and are being explored in multiple different laboratories. There's no hard evidence at this moment to sway for or against a particular molecule at this point of time.
Thank you, sir, giving answers to our questions and to our students, to our scholars. Hope they might have now come up with answers which they were desired. So now I want to connect Kanan sir, as because of him we are able to hear you, and as he was not able to connect through this live event, So now I want to call him so that we can connect through phone. Just a moment, give me. Just I am trying to connect.
Sure, sure.
Hello, sir. Now
Yeah.
over to you.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you, Vinod. Thank you, Vinod.
Thank you, sir.
Lovely presentation, and I must say, I'm very impressed the way you have presented today. I hope my voice is clear.
Yeah, it is clear.
Hello.
Yes, sir. It is clear.
In fact, it's very nice to see somebody who fell in love with bioinformatics and studying virology after doing an MBBS. I think it shows a great passion Vinod has. Look into another side of medicine. Normally, doctors like to practice, but I think here he is brought in a new dimension to thinking. I know quite a few who have attempted this. I used to have a couple of friends who did it. One of them went on to PhD in biochemistry.
I think we lost you.
Great facility because test is being used very effectively, and it's truly a genomic work. The name of Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology has very well fitted in the way Vinod Karia presented his talk on coronavirus, and also I think this is the first time, to my knowledge, that such a large scale experiments are being done on various sites. I think for students, I think it is one of the greatest exposure that as you are seeing somebody is developing a vaccine, somebody is developing a diagnostic kit, and then various types of diagnostic kits are coming. Somebody is talking about immunoboosters, then repurposing the old drugs for this one. And the strangest part is we still don't understand how the virus attacks. And plus, I could see that you are showing so many variants happening. What is seen in India, which is, I think it's a brilliant piece of work. I must compliment all the people who, 705 sequences they presented, classified them, how is their distribution. I think it's a brilliant piece of work, teamwork. A lot of people have got together, and I'm sure, as you showed in one of the slides, that we want every student also to, if some of you are interested, you should also contribute to the open source. This concept of open source was also started by Samir Brahmachari some time back, and I know, my own student in the college, Yesha Basin, was one of the early people who joined him, and I know the whole team. But what I'm saying is that today open source attracted children from all over corners of India. Children who would never have been able to contribute to the mainstream science. I think they have been able to contribute from the remotest parts of India.
That's right.
I think it's a great awakening program, and I like the way Vinod said, please, some of you, if you would like to join in, I think you are free to do it. And one of his slides very clearly said, in whatever way you can contribute, I'm sure Vinod can give you direction, or he can put it.
I think we lost.
Just a minute, I'm connecting. Yes, sir.
what I want to say, children, is that you have been very fortunate to hear from, such a illustrative talk on current research. I mean, it is not somebody else. He has analyzed the data coming out, and he very nicely said, human ribosomal RNA also comes, how to get rid of it, so how to create a quality data, and I remember the other day I had called him and said there have been a lot of reports that is it a genetic engineered virus or is the natural one mutating. He said nobody has published. Everybody is talking about it, but I haven't seen the data. So I like his attitude that I want to see the evidence. I think a lot of stories are floating, and there are a lot of journals which are publishing without even peer review. So I think there are a lot of misinformation also going on, so you should be very careful. And I like the way Vinod Karia said, well, I haven't seen the data, I think that's the right positive attitude. So there will be, when some make hay while the sunshine is the standard word, but that's what we are seeing in this. There are so many papers. I'm told in the last 3 months there have been 5,000 papers. Now, how many of them are really worth it, and how many of them are just confusing the field, I do not. But I think the kind of analysis which Vinod and his team and his friends are doing, trying to be objective rather than just carried away by sensationalism. So I think, thank you so much, Vinod Karia, and I'm sure there are a lot of students who would like to get in touch with you because many of them are confused what to do. And I think, now they would have realized that there is so much to be done. And country is trying to promote modern research. So thank you so much for coming and for really doing it. And I wish you all the best. Thank you, Rashmi, for an excellent coordination. I know coordinating such webinars are not easy, but I think you have done a great job. And thank you so much. And I must say the students asked a lot of questions, which is also very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sir,
Thank you, sir.
Sir, now one common question for our young undergraduate, postgraduate, because we are having all shorter programs. We are having BTech as well as MTech, MSc. We have research scholars, PhD program as well. Sir,
Right.
those who want to get into this computational biology research, or those who want to enter into this new era, you can say that till now they are into the wet lab and now they want to get into the computational. So what do you suggest them how to come up, how they should groom themselves so that they can in future invade in this type of research?
Yeah, so people who are interested in computational biology, the best thing that they can start doing is to start learning a bit of programming. Right, you could start learning in any language that you're, or any scripting tool that you want to. It could be Perl, it could be Python, it could be R, whatever is comfortable. So, but if you know of one programming language or a scripting language, that would be the first requirement to get into computational biology, because a lot of computational biology requires handling large amount of data, not just manually, but using programs. So the rest is all based on your interest. So it is not necessary that you need to do a master's in bioinformatics to become a computational biologist. Absolutely no. You can still become a master's in biotechnology, a master's in pure science. It could be even be zoology or botany. But as long as you have a deep interest in computers, deep interest in analytical approaches, deep interest in programming, you can still become a computational biologist.
Thank you, sir, for answering to our students. Now, I think we should wind up this process. And sir, many, many thanks. I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for giving us time and sharing this knowledge to our students, to our faculty. We are privileged to have the information about the COVID-19, the situation in India, the research which your lab is doing, and you are involved. So thanks for encouraging also. And I want to thank our chair professor, Dr. K. Kannan sir, because of his effort, we are able to connect you. And this is really a very, you can say that important and very useful webinar, through which we gained a lot of knowledge, lot of information regarding to COVID. Hope in future we will connect you again, sir, for the session. And I want to thank you, our Dean Research as well, the Dr. Sarita Sachdeva. She encouraged a lot, and currently she is COVID Task Force member. And our entire biotech faculty, I thank them for being cooperating here. To our viewers, to all viewers who connected from different part of India. So right now we have attendees from different labs, from different institute, different universities. So I sincerely thank them. So thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is always my pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, bye, sir. Bye. Welcome.